Okay. Is everyone able to hear me okay? Give a thumbs up. Perfect. I do have it pulled up on my phone as well, so I can try to keep track whether or not I have the right screen shared. We'll see how that goes. So, uh, just a little introduction. My name is Aiden. I am one of the PhD students in the Counselor Education and Supervision program. I'm really excited to talk to you all tonight about narrative therapy. It's a counseling theory that was actually pretty new to me. I work as a crisis counselor, and this is not a modality that we use very often at all. So it was great to learn about, and I'm really excited to share what I learned with you guys. So, like I said, we're going to do a quick little check-in about where your current knowledge is with narrative therapy, how comfortable you feel with it. So I'm going to switch over to those results real quick. And it looks like most of the middle, we got about 4 folks who said I read the textbook chapter. I think there's some vague memories there. And then a couple of people are like, I feel pretty confident, which is good. You're going to be the people I turn to for help.
Yeah, I was going to ask Aiden, I don't know if it's me or it might get a little bit more stable, but your internet was in and out, or it might be the sound.
Yeah, mine too.
Is it yours too? Okay.
Now, it's better. It was better just now. It wasn't choppy. Just then it wasn't choppy.
I said it wasn't choppy.
Yeah,
it's I'm in an apartment building. Good. Perfect. Okay. Well, let me know if it becomes an issue again, and I can check it. All right. So I'm actually going to start a little activity. So I'd like you to grab a piece of paper or open a blank document on your computer. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a place where you can jot down some quick ideas. At the top of you to write your name, add an apostrophe S, and then life story. So you should read something like Aiden's life story. I want you to make 6 spaces where you're going to write chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, etc., until you have spaces for 6 chapters. And if you're feeling rushed, you'll have more time to work on this. I'm just going to go through the instructions quick. So the next thing I want you to do is to title those chapters, whatever comes to mind. And then either next to the chapter title or underneath it or wherever it makes sense, just jot down a word or two, maybe even a short sentence about how you would describe those chapters. So when you feel like you're in a good place, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. All right. I'm seeing some people looking up. If you're not quite ready, that's okay. I'm not going to force you to share. I'm not that mean. Um, so I'm going to take a look at my example just to give you an idea of what this could look like. In particular, so I started my first chapter with lived experience because I was diagnosed as a teenager with bipolar disorder. And it really influences who I am, uh, the way that I live my life, the way that I take care of myself, but also the way that the work that I do and the things that I'm passionate about. After that, I originally was studying emergency medicine, and then I started taking more and more psychology classes. And that really, for me, was like, oh, I like this. I think this is something I'm interested in. And I made the switch. Program, which was my chapter 3, was really the first time that I settled on that counselor identity. It was the first time that I was like, yep, this is my career path. This is a part of who I am. So it was a really meaningful program for me. I actually started my career in school counseling. And even though I'm no longer a school counselor, and you could see that as a failure, um, it was a really meaningful time for me because it solidified the kind of work that I wanted to do in counseling and the kind of counselor I wanted to be. And I realized that in the school district, that was not the place that I could do it. So again, it just kind of shaped who I was and my identity. Crisis counseling. So I just ran a mobile crisis program. I thought, okay, I'll give this a try. And it turns out I love crisis counseling. That is 100% my thing. So it really was when I found my niche and the type of counseling that I want to do. Add to being here at Chicago because as much as I love actually doing the crisis counseling work, I was really curious about how we train counselors to deal with crisis situations, especially around suicide and advanced psychosis. So I was really like, yep, this is what I want to do, and um, this is how I'm going to continue my journey. Oops, no one too far. So as you can probably imagine, you're exercising from my exercise. While there's so much in these chapters, there's so much more to me than just these chapters. Um, my lived experiences, there are clients throughout my career that have shaped my view of things, times where I've encountered hardships or challenges. Um, and there are times where that first chapter, my lived experience with bipolar disorder, has really impacted other chapters. And so, as much as this gives a narrative of me and my life, there is also a lot of detail in the background that you aren't aware of if you just looked at this. So that's why I want you to think to your stories that you wrote down. Take a look at what you wrote. So that you chose. Was there a theme that you focused on, like career, personal life, relationships, or were you more kind of holistic with your approach? Are your chapters topical, like based on different items, or were they chronological? There are chapter titles. Did you focus on bad things? Did you focus on good things? What were the kind of things that you naturally just kind of threw onto paper when I gave you a short period of time to do it? And then what about the number of chapters? I limited you to 6. Was it hard to think of 6 things? Was it really easy to think of 6 things and you would have added a million other things? Did you narrow down your focus just because you only had 6 chapters to work from? So when we talk about counseling, we use a lot of buzzwords like client-centered or meeting people where they were at. Um, these speak a lot to our values in our profession, where we want to give people the chance to be authentic, be themselves while we help them through some difficult times. But note how even in this exercise where I gave you a lot of freedom, I also limited you in some ways. So I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we talk more in depth about what narrative therapy looks like. So a little more structured, some actual objectives for tonight. By the end of our time today, you should have to describe the history and the development of narrative therapy, understand some key components and some rationale behind this approach, and hopefully learn a few different techniques of narrative therapy that can be used with clients in different contexts. I'll have some slides that are covering basic material, and then we'll be taking a look at a role play that Nancy was wonderful in helping me create to kind of demonstrate the theory in action. At the end of the lesson, I'll also have some sample NCE questions to sort of test your knowledge going forward with narrative therapy. I'm going to save time at the end for questions, but you can also type them into the chat box. I'll be trying to monitor that. If there continues to be internet issues, go ahead and interrupt me, ask me to repeat something. I'm usually pretty good as a crisis counselor at taking a different turn and trying something new, so feel free to interrupt. And then at the very end, I will be posting a link in the chat box for an exit survey for you to fill out. That's really important for the department to kind of get back about how I did. All right. So narrative therapy was developed in the 1980s and the 1990s by David Epstein and Michael White. So it's still a relatively new theory, especially compared to some of the other theories like psychoanalytic or cognitive behavioral. Epstein and White wanted to find a way to connect with clients in a way that was really empowering, and it moved away from this model of pathologizing people. So one of the big things that they believed in is that reality is subjective, a concept that we will really talk about a lot tonight. But essentially, what is real to me can be very, very different from what's real to you, which can be very, very different from what's real to someone else. So for example, if we're thinking from a social justice lens, as a white person, my reality has taught me, for the most part, that the world is fair, and if I work hard enough, I can get anything that I want in the world. That's my subjective reality. However, to a person of color who's had to deal with discrimination and racism, and just prejudice their whole life, their reality may be that the world's not fair. And luck and chance and good timing have a lot more to do with it. So which one of us is right? And how awful would it be if I was to insist that my reality was the right one and just completely dismiss someone else's experiences with the world? All right, well, now I know not to. That concept of subjective is really big to narrative therapy, and the idea that Epstein and White really wanted to get behind is that each of us has our own experiences, and narrative therapy aims at looking at those experiences. So they were influenced by a number of psychologists and philosophers in what's called the postmodern paradigm. Essentially, in postmodern philosophies, again, that reality is subjective and it's constructed by the individual. So there are three particular people who kind of influenced their work. Gregory Bateson was a social scientist and an anthropologist. He focused a lot of his work on communication. So he emphasized what he called the interpretive method, where since we can't know an objective reality, we can only know our own subjective realities. we have to rely on interpretations of experiences. So we can't know for sure whether or not the world is fair, but we each have experiences and interpretations of those experiences which influence our view of the world and our opinion about whether or not the world is fair. Milton Erickson was a psychiatrist and a hypnotist, and he utilized a technique that's called teaching tales, where he had clients tell stories about themselves. Then, while working with the client, they would expand on that story and try to shift a negative experience into a positive view. Oh dear. And then finally, Michael Foucault was a philosopher who focused on theories of power and knowledge in post-structuralism. And from his view, power is used to limit and to control people in societies. And the primary way that we do that is through knowledge, through what we consider common knowledge. So we take certain things to be true and common knowledge in our society because people in power have told us that those things are true. So again, for a long time, it was taken as common knowledge that, white people were somehow superior to non-white people. Now we know that is absolutely not true. It's something that was used to control non-white people and have power over other people. So this was something that Foucault really focused on, is how we make meaning from interactions with the world around us and how people in power influence that. So from that, Upstart and White focused on some key tenets to base narrative therapy on. The first was that reality is subjective. We each have our own reality, which is constructed and influenced by our experiences, our relationships, and the context we live in. So my experience of an event, my interpretation of its meaning may be very different from yours because I have a completely different set of experiences, relationships, and life contexts to base my interpretation off of. They believe people create narratives of their lives to explain those realities. So I talked earlier about having been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I was very, very lucky to have been diagnosed young. I had a great psychiatrist, I had a great therapist in my life, and I've had supportive friends throughout my life who have really helped me in dealing with my disorder. So my narrative of bipolar disorder is that it's treatable, there's medication, there's counseling out there, and having healthy relationships helps me stay healthy. Because I have that narrative of bipolar that's got a positive lens to it, I can incorporate that into my broader life narrative, in that just because I have bipolar disorder doesn't mean I can't live a meaningful and fulfilling life. However, Epstein and White really focused on how negative narratives can lead to negative worldviews. So if I didn't believe that I could get better, or I thought I was always going to suffer from bipolar disorder, I may incorporate that into my life narrative negatively. So if I believed that I will always have uncontrollable moods, that I will always drive people that I love away, then there's no point in continuing on. Life is always going to be just chaos. And that's a very different worldview from just one negative narrative. So from this collection of subjective realities and our collective narratives, we end up developing what's called a dominant discourse. This is our view of how we're supposed to live, think, act, and approach life. This dominant discourse is influenced by the people and the context around us, the cultures we grow up in, the people that raise us. So, for example, in the United States, our culture and our systems of power have long promoted the idea of meritocracy, or that people can advance in life due to skill and hard work. For many of us, we may have grown up believing that if we just try hard enough, we just work hard enough, we just sacrifice enough, we can do or get anything that we want. But what about our people, our our neighbors who are stuck in cycles of poverty. They may be working 2 or 3 jobs, yet they still can't ever seem to pay the bills because they've had to buy a cheap pair of work boots, which was all they could afford at the time. Their boots ending up needing to be replaced sooner, and in the long run, they end up spending more money. Um, or they keep working with old boots and get a foot injury that leads to them missing weeks of work and pay. If their discourse is that they just need to suck it up and keep working, they might see that injury and that missed work time as a personal failure. Um, this can change their personal narrative of themselves, that they're a failure, they're lazy, they're stupid because they got hurt at work when they knew better, and so on. So suddenly we have a lot of psychological pain and suffering all over a pair of boots. So narrative therapy really aims at looking at those narratives that people make about themselves and the world around them and seeing if there are any ways to reauthor or to rewrite the narratives in a way that reduces some of that suffering and brings in a little bit of hope. It focuses on those client stories and their experiences. Um, those experiences can be problem or failure oriented, which is likely if they're seeking out counseling, but they can also be solution or success oriented. The importance isn't necessarily the events themselves, but the interpretations of the events. So the counselor and the client work together to construct what they call a landscape of action or sequence of events that happened. Clients tend to focus on details that led them to their interpretation of the events. It is the counselor's job, however, to listen for details that might be telling a different story or use particular questions to tease out those details. And we're going to talk about that more in a second because those are some of the techniques used in narrative therapy. So hopefully in exploring these narratives with the clients, we find what's called a subordinate storyline, or a time when things were different or contrasted with that main narrative that the client's been holding on to. And we kind of help the client recognize that subordinate storyline and see if they want to incorporate that into their narrative. If they do, the client then can choose to reauthor their story, giving it more detail and a different lens to the narrative that's healthier and reduces that suffering. So for example, going back to the boots example, which we're going to be using a lot tonight, a client may say something like, yes, my boots were broken because I bought the cheap ones, but I didn't have money for the nicer ones at the time. I spent that money providing for my family, which was more important to me. Just because I bought the shoddy boots doesn't mean I'm a shoddy person. I had to make a difficult choice, and I chose to use that money to keep the lights on. So that's a different, more positive, hopeful narrative from, I'm an idiot because I bought the wrong boots. So where do you fit in this? Narrative therapy is about the client's subjective reality, not ours. We're not there to tell them that their thinking is flawed or that they're viewing things wrong. We're almost just kind of a watcher of their story. We're hearing their experience. And it's our job instead to ask questions to help drive out some more of the details of that narrative and see if the client has another way of constructing the story they've made about themselves. So our role here is really collaborative and it's not corrective. The client is the expert in their experiences. It's their world that they're living in. At the end of the day, they leave the session, they're going back to their world and their subjective reality. So our role is to be the experts in the process of therapy and to use those specialized techniques to tease out details in the story. Because of that, it's really important in narrative therapy that we approach from a place of genuine curiosity. We want to hear the story and we want to dive into it. We also want to acknowledge how privileged we are to hear this person's stories. Um, they're sharing with us some very vulnerable personal things. And so a big part of narrative therapy is just being thankful to be able to share that experience with the client.